Well, thank you very much for that introduction, and let me say what a pleasure it is to be here. And Grandmother Dorothy, thank you for your opening. It was full of wisdom. We do have some difficult decisions to take, and we are trying to do them in the best way possible. So thank you. It is wonderful to be back here in Toronto to discuss an issue that matters to everyone. That is the Canadian labor market. And I'm particularly pleased to be back in a university setting, on a university campus, to explore the future of workers and jobs. I want to thank the Public Policy Forum for inviting me to engage with students, with researchers, with thought leaders on this important topic. My governing council colleagues and I meet with stakeholders of all kinds, with business people, with community groups, with unions, with students. And everywhere we go, we get many of the same questions. First, people ask about inflation and interest rates, and controlling inflation is our top priority, and I'm certainly going to talk about that today. Everyone also wants to know about jobs and about the labor market. And there are three questions that regularly come up. Why can't businesses find enough workers? Are we going into a recession? And does that mean a big rise in unemployment? And what is the Bank of Canada's role in supporting maximum sustainable employment? So today I want to address these questions, and I'm going to tackle them in three parts. First, I want to outline how inflation and the labor market are linked. I'll explain that returning to low, stable inflation is the best way to achieve maximum sustainable employment. Our mandate is explicit about that. Second, I want to highlight how the Canadian labor market was hit by COVID-19, how it recovered, and what we expect in the coming months. And finally, I want to discuss structural changes in the labor market, such as the aging of the population, that we'd be grappling with even if we hadn't had a pandemic. I'm going to discuss what we'll be watching and what Canadian governments and businesses can do to help grow the supply of labor. Since the bank was founded, its mandate has been to promote the economic and financial welfare of Canada. As we said when we renewed our monetary policy framework last December, the Government of Canada and the Bank of Canada believe that the best contribution monetary policy can make to the well-being of Canadians is to deliver price stability. This is formalized with an inflation target, which is the 2% midpoint of a 1% to 3% inflation control range. The government and the bank also agree that monetary policy should continue to support maximum sustainable employment. We recognize that maximum sustainable employment is not directly measurable and is determined largely by non-monetary factors that can change through time. This really reflects the reality that maximum sustainable employment is more of a concept than a number. In practice, knowing that we've reached it is difficult, because we have to infer where it is, and labor market indicators give us clear signals only when we are well above or below it. Finally, well-anchored inflation expectations are critical to both price stability and maximum sustainable employment. That's why the government and the bank agree that the primary objective of monetary policy is to maintain low, stable inflation over time. What I want to stress here is that maximum sustainable employment and inflation close to the 2% target go hand in hand. If employment is well below its maximum sustainable level, the economy is missing jobs, it's missing incomes, and spending will be below the economy's productive capacity. This puts downward pressure on inflation, pushing it below the target. That's what happened early in the pandemic. If the economy is operating above maximum sustainable employment, businesses won't be able to find enough workers. That's going to put upward pressure on prices, and that's going to push inflation above our target. That's where we are today. At almost 7%, inflation is well above the 2% target. Inflation in Canada partly reflects global factors, things like sharply higher prices for many commodities and internationally traded goods. But much of the inflation we're experiencing today reflects domestic factors, namely excess demand in the Canadian economy. Our economy is overheated. Job vacancies are elevated and businesses are reporting widespread labor shortages. Over the last 6 months, wage growth has increased and broadened across the economy. The unemployment rate in June hit a record low, and while that seems like a good thing, it's not sustainable. The tightness of the labor market is a symptom of the general imbalance between demand and supply, and that is fueling inflation, which is hurting all Canadians. Depuis mars, la Banque relève le taux directeur pour aider à ramener l'inflation à la cible. Les taux d'intérêt plus élevés vont ralentir les dépenses et la demande de main-d'œuvre. Avec le temps, ça va alléger les pressions inflationnistes intérieures. On essaie de mettre en balance les risques liés à un resserrement trop faible ou trop fort de la politique monétaire. Si on n'augmente pas assez les taux d'intérêt, les Canadiens et les Canadiennes vont continuer à subir les effets de l'inflation élevée. Et celle-ci va s'enraciner. Il faudra alors des taux d'intérêt beaucoup plus élevés et un ralentissement beaucoup plus prononcé de l'économie pour restaurer la stabilité des prix. Si on augmente trop les taux d'intérêt, l'économie va ralentir plus qu'il faut. Le chômage va beaucoup monter et l'inflation va tomber sous la cible. Ce n'est pas facile de trouver le juste équilibre. Since March, we've been raising our policy interest rate to help bring inflation back to our target. Higher interest rates will work to slow spending and labor demand in the economy, and over time, will relieve domestic inflationary pressures. We're trying to balance the risks of over and under tightening monetary policy. If we don't raise interest rates enough, Canadians will continue to endure high inflation, and high inflation will become entrenched. That will require much higher interest rates and a sharper slowing of the economy to restore price stability. If we raise interest rates too much, the economy will slow more than it needs to, unemployment will rise considerably, and inflation will undershoot our target. Getting the balance right is no easy task. And I want to explain what we'll be watching in the labor market as we make monetary policy decisions in the months ahead. That starts with a look at the upheaval of the pandemic and what Canadian workers have been through over the last 2.5 years. The recent history of the labor market can be broken down into 3 distinct phases: the pandemic-related economic shutdowns, the recovery that came with reopening, and the current environment of excess demand. So let me address these each in turn. The COVID-19 pandemic caused the biggest global downturn since the Great Depression. Much of the economy was shut down to contain the spread of the virus, and millions of people lost their jobs. In Canada, we plunged into the deepest recession on record, and the effects were devastating. Roughly 3 million people who were employed before the pandemic were out of work by April 2020, and another 2.5 million were working less than half their usual hours. The shock hit workplaces from coast to coast to coast. But it hit very unequally. Work that required close contact with people, mainly in the service sector, was shut down. That disproportionately affected youth, women, and low-wage workers. The closure of schools and daycares hit women with young children harder, and they experienced a greater decline in hours worked. Never before has so much of the economy been shut down so suddenly and for so long. We were very concerned that it would result in scarring. In other words, we were worried that the damage to the incomes and careers of a whole segment of the population, particularly women, youth, and immigrants, would be permanent. That brings me to the second phase of the recovery, the fastest recovery ever. Do you remember the first year of the pandemic? We couldn't travel abroad or even much in Canada, so we stayed home. We renovated our homes to accommodate working and studying remotely, and we bought goods to replace the fun we'd normally be having in the service sector. Just 4 months after the employment lows of April, nearly 2/3 of the job losses were recouped. Pourquoi la reprise était si rapide? C'est surtout parce que la récession a été causée par un événement sans précédent, la pandémie, et non pas par des déséquilibres ou les problèmes de structure dans l'économie. Quand l'économie a rouvert, l'emploi a donc vite repris. On s'attendait à un vif rebond de l'emploi à la réouverture, mais on redoutait que trop de personnes soient laissées derrière. Heureusement, les séquelles n'ont pas été aussi profondes qu'on pensait, parce que l'emploi s'est redressé rapidement. La réponse simultanée des gouvernements et des banques centrales a joué un rôle important dans la reprise. Au Canada, des politiques budgétaires ont permis de maintenir le lien entre travailleurs et employeurs et d'aider les entreprises à survivre malgré les faibles revenus. La détérioration du marché du travail a donc été limitée. Les mesures de politique monétaire ont complété les politiques budgétaires. On a baissé le taux directeur et introduit l'assouplissement quantitatif pour réduire les coûts d'emprunt. Ça a stimulé les dépenses et contribué à remettre l'emploi sur la bonne voie. The reopening of schools and daycares helped too. As schools returned to in-class teaching, mothers went back to work. This reduced the uneven impact of the pandemic, but it didn't eliminate it. As the vaccination rate increased in the economy and the economy reopened, those employed in the goods-producing industries returned to work sooner than those engaged in hard-to-distance sector. But overall, the rapid pace of recovery we experienced is unheard of, far faster than past recessions. That brings me to 2022 and our current labor market. We are in excess demand, where the economy's need for labor is outpacing its ability to supply it. At the end of last year, it was not obvious that the labor market would rapidly overheat in 2022. You'll remember the Omicron variant was spreading, and COVID-19 case numbers were once again rising. But looking through the volatility in the labor market caused by waves of the pandemic, we can now see a clear trend of an increasingly tight labor market in 2022. Employment growth remained strong, reports of labor shortages increased, and wage growth picked up. To meet rising demand, employers reached more deeply into the labor market, and they found some new workers. Hiring of immigrants, especially recent immigrants, increased, easing prime-age employment gaps relative to Canadian-born workers. Pandemic innovation and strong labor demand also brought more flexibility to some jobs, due partly to digitalization accelerated by the pandemic. We began raising our policy interest rate in March to cool this overheated economy, but the momentum in the labor market held. Employment gains continued and labor shortages intensified through the spring. The unemployment rate reached a record low of 4.9% in June. Job vacancies exceeded 1 million in the second quarter, a new record. Rising vacancies with low unemployment were clear signs that the economy was out of balance, with demand running ahead of supply. In recent months, we've seen initial signs of these exceptionally tight labor markets starting to ease. Since the spring, employment has leveled off, and the unemployment has crept up a little to 5.2%. Wage growth has risen, but it looks to be plateauing. Job vacancies have started to decline, and their softening has been more evident in sectors that are more sensitive to interest rates, like manufacturing and construction. As we look ahead, there are two elements to achieving a better balanced labor market: demand and supply. Demand for labor needs to moderate so supply can catch up. And the more labor supply grows over time, the less slowing is needed in labor demand to restore and maintain price stability. The first part, slowing demand, is what we influence with interest rate increases. Generally, low unemployment and high demand for workers benefits the Canadian economy. Good jobs are the best way to reduce inequality and ensure that Canadians have the incomes they need to meet the needs of their families. But right now, we need the economy to slow down. With more modest spending growth, the demand for labor by businesses will ease. Vacancies will decline, and the labor market will come into better balance. This will relieve price pressures. Increasingly, we hear concerns that Europe, the United States, and even Canada are heading for a recession. As we said in our October monetary policy report, we expect growth in Canada to stall in the next few quarters. In other words, we expect growth to be close to zero. that means that 2 or 3/4 of slightly negative growth is just as likely as 2 or 3/4 of slightly positive growth. Now, that's not a severe recession, but it is a significant slowing in the economy. Slower growth will likely lead to higher unemployment. We know that job losses have a human cost. But because the labor market is so hot and we have an exceptionally high number of vacant jobs, there is scope to cool the labor market without causing the kind of large surge in unemployment that we have typically experienced in recessions. As we use higher interest rates to cool inflation, we'll be watching very closely for signs that the economy and the labor market are responding. And one way to explore the needed adjustment in our labor market is through the lens of what economists call the Beveridge curve. This curve depicts the typically inverse relationship between job vacancies and unemployment. As job vacancies decline, unemployment usually goes up. But by how much? That depends on where the labor market is along the curve. Generally speaking, when job vacancies are high, as they are now, a decline in vacancies does not lead to as big an increase in the unemployment rate as it does when vacancies are low to begin with. Analysis of Canada's Beveridge curve by Bank of Canada economists suggests that the unemployment rate would rise somewhat if the job vacancy rate returns to more normal levels. But it would not be high unemployment by historical standards. So what does that mean for Canadian workers? Well, it's clear that this adjustment is not going to be painless. Lower vacancies mean that it could take longer to find a job, and some businesses are going to find that with less demand for their products, they don't have enough work for all their workers. But relieving the pressure in the labor market will contribute to restoring price stability. We'll be watching a broad set of indicators to gauge the health of the labor market and how it is adjusting to tighter monetary policy. As we watch to see how the economy is responding to higher interest rates, we expect that some parts of the economy will be more sensitive to higher borrowing costs and will slow earlier or more sharply. The response will be somewhat uneven. Some industries, more than others, will see fewer vacancies and even job losses. We'll be looking beyond the headline employment numbers to gauge how different groups in the labor market are adjusting. And last year, we launched a new dashboard of indicators to help assess the overall health of the labor market and where we are relative to maximum sustainable employment. That brings me to the second component of getting the labor market into better balance: labor supply. The labor market is also being and will continue to be profoundly affected by supply-side developments that are beyond the scope of monetary policy. That brings us back to one of the frequently asked questions: where are all the workers? Well, the short answer is most of them are working and some of them have retired. We now have 500,000 more people employed than we did before the COVID-19 pandemic hit. But an increase in retirements and less immigration early in the pandemic have reduced labor force growth. That's another reason why the labor market is so tight. These demographic shifts have played a big role in the supply of labor. In Canada, as in many advanced economies, the age group that grew the fastest in recent years was those aged 65 and over. That's not pandemic related, it's simply the aging of baby boomers. And those over 65 tend to have the lowest labor force participation rate. And that has been pulling down the growth rate of Canada's labor force in recent years. Now, immigration has typically helped Canada's labor force grow, but the pandemic disrupted immigration flows. Borders closed, and Canada fell short of its 2020 immigration target, resulting in roughly 100,000 fewer new workers. Fortunately, immigration is bouncing back as border restrictions return to normal. Canada's met its immigration target of 401,000 in 2021. And based on the increases in the immigration target since then, the shortfall in permanent residents caused by the pandemic should be recouped in 2023. Now, many advanced economies whose populations are aging are looking to increase immigration to meet the needs of their labor markets. But because of relatively higher immigration targets, Canada will have an advantage in coming years. Canada's population growth is expected to far exceed that of other G7 countries. This is a key reason why the growth outlook in our October monetary policy report exceeds that of some of our peers, including the United States. The strong immigration targets suggest that net immigration will account for over 2/3 of the expected growth in Canada's potential output. The strength of the labour market has helped to improve outcomes for recent immigrants. We can also increase participation by other workers, including women, if we leverage the changes that these tight labour markets have brought. The pandemic showed us how important childcare is. When it disappeared, so did many female workers. Canada's female participation rate is higher than the United States, but other countries have higher female participation than we do. We're only just above the median of OECD countries. Improvements to universal childcare may help narrow these differences, though the full effects will take some time. Other populations may also benefit from improved labour market access. This includes Indigenous peoples, who have a younger and faster growing population than many other groups. Potential for remote work, as well as training to develop skills in areas with critical labor shortages, may open new opportunities for groups facing local labor market challenges. And companies need to do their part to attract and retain new segments of the labor force. By adjusting to and taking advantage of structural changes in the labor market, Canada can increase the sustainable growth rate of our economy. An increased supply of workers raises the rate the economy can grow without generating inflationary pressures. But enhancing supply does take time, and it also creates new demand. New workers will have new incomes, and that will add to spending in the economy. That's why increasing supply, while it's valuable, it's critical, it's not a substitute for using monetary policy to moderate demand and bring demand and supply into balance. Now it's time for me to conclude. Since the onset of COVID-19, the labor market has been in tremendous turmoil. The pandemic caused a surge in unemployment and had a terribly uneven impact, exacerbating inequality already faced by women, youth, and marginalized workers. We were very concerned about widespread job losses, deep cuts in consumer spending, and ultimately deflation. But the recovery was swift and across the board, with the fastest rebound in employment ever. Now the economy's gone too far in the other direction. The economy's in excess demand, the job market is too tight, and inflation is too high. Monetary policy has begun to have an impact, but it will take time for the effects of higher interest rates to spread through the economy and reduce demand and inflation. Once we get through the slowdown, growth will pick up. Our economy will grow solidly again, and with healthy employment and low inflation. How much employment growth we can achieve while maintaining low inflation will depend on the growth of the supply of labor. This is fundamental. This is the fundamental concept that maximum sustainable employment captures. It's not maximum employment, it's how much employment the economy can sustain while maintaining price stability. As I said earlier, we can't have one without the other. Growing maximum sustainable employment is a shared responsibility of government, businesses, and workers. Increased immigration adds potential workers, and governments need to ensure newcomers have a smooth path into the workforce with credential recognition and settlement support like language and skills training. Businesses need to invest in training so we can reduce the skills mismatch. And workers need to invest in the skills the new economy needs. Our priority at the Bank of Canada is to restore price stability. Il faut s'assurer que l'inflation élevée ne s'enracine pas. Si ça arrive, rien ne va bien fonctionner. C'est ce qui s'est passé dans les années 70. L'inflation n'a pas pu être maîtrisée et les taux d'inflation et de chômage ont monté. Les conflits de travail se sont multipliés parce que les travailleurs faisaient face à des hausses importantes du coût de la vie. En fin de compte, il a fallu des taux d'intérêt encore plus élevés et une récession grave, avec une forte hausse de chômage pour maîtriser l'inflation et ancrer de nouveau les attentes. C'est exactement ce qu'on veut éviter. The overriding imperative is to ensure that high inflation does not become entrenched, because if that happens, nothing works well. This was the experience of the 1970s. The failure to control inflation resulted in high inflation and high unemployment. Labor strife increased as workers tried to cope with large increases in the cost of living. And ultimately, it took much higher interest rates and a severe recession with a large increase in unemployment to rein in inflation and re-anchor inflation expectations. That's exactly what everyone wants to avoid. That's why we front-loaded our interest rate increases, and that's why we are resolute in our commitment to return inflation to the 2% target. To get there, we need to rebalance the labor market. This will be a difficult adjustment. We want to do this in the best way possible for Canadian workers and businesses. Higher interest rates will help cool spending and the demand for labor in the economy. This will give supply time to catch up, relieving price pressures. And we'll be monitoring a wide range of indicators to assess this rebalancing and Canada's sustainable growth rate. Canada has some advantages that will help support our labor supply, creating more capacity for growth. The best contribution monetary policy can make to a healthy labor market is to deliver price stability. With inflation and inflation expectations well anchored on the 2% target, our economy, our workers, and our businesses will be positioned for growth and prosperity. Thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Governor Macklem. Next up, we have 15 to 20 minutes of discussion and Q&A. To moderate, I would like to introduce Edward Greenspan, President and CEO of the Public Policy Forum. As you'll see on the screens, we're using Slido for the questions, so please visit the website slido.com and enter ID #labor, so you can submit your questions there and then also upvote the questions you'd like to hear asked today. Over to you, Ed.
Thank you very much, Senator Christine, and thank you, Governor. That was a pretty meaty speech. Good.
Thank you.
Now we get to the people's portion here, and I'll lead it off though with one or two quick questions off the top. I think a lot of people were very curious last week when the jobs numbers came out that we had 108,000 jobs created while you're trying to slow the economy. I don't know, I think it spoke well to the country. I don't know how well it spoke to, what grade you gave yourself on this, but jobs created is always a good thing. But it's mystifying, and mystifying, I think, for a whole bunch of folks. So I realize a month is just a month. I realize that monthly numbers get revised. Nonetheless, it's a pretty definitive month. What did you make of that?
Well, I think, Ed, as you said, labor force comes out every month. I will say it's one of the indicators we look at very closely. There's a lot of richness in the labor force survey. And if you look over the last several months, employment growth was growing very quickly through to about the summer. So there was a number of declines. The last number was up, but overall, over the last few months, it's been relatively flat. And if you look at a level deeper, what you can see is that the parts of the economy that are more interest sensitive, like construction, like manufacturing, you have seen employment growth slow more in those sectors. Where you're still seeing, if you look at that last month labor force survey, where you're still seeing growth is more in the service sector, and that is a lot of that is the economy's reopened. People want to consume a lot of those services they've missed for the last 2.5 years during the pandemic, and businesses are having a hard time finding enough workers to meet the demand. So you're still seeing some growth there. It's going to take some time for, we've raised interest rates rapidly, forcefully. We've indicated we probably need to raise rates some more. But even the rate increases we've already done, you're starting to see some effect of that, but you haven't seen the full effect yet. It will take some time to work its way through the economy. that will rebalance the economy and reduce those inflationary pressures. But it will take some time.
Okay, so you were also discussing in the speech the relationship between supply of labor, demand, supply being a longer-term factor. But there were some economists last week, and again, I'm wondering, what you make of this, who were saying that the other number that was very interesting was that there were 110,000 people who joined the labor market last month. And some of the analysis spoke to some of that was immigration picking up again. Some of it might have been childcare beginning to bite economically, and that might relieve some of the pressure on you. Does that relieve some of the pressure on you?
Well, look, the more we can expand supply, the more people come into the labor force, the more quickly new immigrants get settled. They find that first job. That is certainly going to help. And businesses have a responsibility to reach into the labor force, to find workers, to train workers. Governments have a responsibility to provide the language training and the credential recognition and the skills development to get new immigrants into the labor force quickly. As you said, those things are going to take some time, and they certainly complement what we're doing. But given inflation 7%, given the economy is overheated, and one symptom of that is a very tight labor market, there is a need to slow demand. How much we need to slow it, that will depend on how supply responds. I would just also highlight that there is more to supply than the supply of labor. I mean, the other part is productivity. What is the output per worker? And one of the things about COVID is that because there have been a lot of supply chain disruptions, because companies have had to put in new protocols to keep everybody healthy, that has impeded productivity. It's very hard for businesses to plan when they don't know if they're going to get the materials, then they get them. By the time they get them, the demand may have shifted. It's made planning difficult. As things get more normal, we do expect productivity is going to come up too. So that should also help. But given the economy is clearly in excess demand and inflation is too high, we do need to moderate spending as supply is coming up, so the two can get better balanced.
Okay, one more question, then we're going to turn to the audience, which is about the composition of the labor market. And you said how you're looking at different groups and how they're faring. So again, I think there's some economic analysis that a lot of people who lost their job early in the pandemic had to find other work, and they tended to lose low-paying jobs. And many of them have re-entered, I don't know what numbers, perhaps re-entered the labor market at higher paying jobs, and that might explain also part of the wage growth number. So that sounds like a pretty good trend.
Yes, and I think when people find jobs that are better suited to their skills, where they can really fully utilize their skills, they tend to be higher wage, they also tend to be more productive. And higher productivity is what sustains higher wages. So yes, that can be a good thing. And we've certainly seen some of that. I will say, though, that analyzing, if you look at aggregate measures of wages, they've been tough to analyze in the pandemic. So, for example, when the economy plunged at the beginning part of the pandemic, it particularly hit low-wage workers. So the low-wage workers weren't working, so the average wage actually went up, which seemed very counterintuitive when you're in the depths of a... So you have to... There's so much about this pandemic that is just completely unprecedented that you do have to be careful interpreting the data, and you have to try to, as much as you can, control for these really exceptional effects of the pandemic.
Okay, let's go to some audience questions here. I'm going to start with the middle one from Mark. What role, if any, do you see for automation, labor-saving technologies in addressing near and longer-term labor market constraints? Well, there's no question when we talk to businesses. So businesses, they're
they're running up against capacity constraints. Part of that is labor, but it's not only labor. And certainly what we're hearing from businesses is companies that are running up against capacity constraints. So what that means is basically they can't produce all the goods and services their clients want. They're just, they're leaving money on the table. They can't provide everything their customers want. Unfortunately, one way they respond to that is they raise prices. The other way they're responding to it, though, is they are increasing their investment. And as I mentioned, we do expect to see some improvement in productivity just as things normalize. But the other part of improving productivity is finding ways to do more with less. Using automation to improve the efficiency, the productivity of worker. If you give workers better tools, you give them better computers, better machinery and equipment, they can produce more per unit of time. That's productivity. And so that's good for workers. It makes them more productive. That over time should increase their wages, but it's also good for our economy because it expands the growth capacity of our economy. There are only so many workers in the economy. We're trying to increase that number with immigration, but if you can increase output per worker, you can grow without creating inflationary pressures.
Right, so I'm just going to turn around a little bit of a question that was submitted earlier, speaking to this point. So as wages are going up, as there might be a little bit more of a power shift towards labor side with the labor shortage, and as people might be moving up the jobs curve a little bit, does that put a significant material pressure that's measurable and that you can observe on businesses to innovate rather than hire? To stop having people squeezing water out of lobster, let's say, and actually, have machines do that part of the job.
Well, businesses are trying to cope with this too. So we've seen a few things. One of the things we've seen is that because the economy is overheated and companies can't meet all the demands of their clients, they're raising prices, and they're actually passing through increases in their input costs faster to their final prices than they have historically. And the other part of that is once people come to expect higher inflation, there's less competitive forces on companies to worry that they're going to lose customers if they raise their price. And that's the part that we really need to fix. We need to slow the economy down, bring it into balance, and so those competitive forces start working better. What we'd like to see companies do more of is invest in finding new workers, training new workers, developing workers, and investing in new technologies, in better ways of organizing production so they can get more output per worker. So we see companies doing all of those things. We'd like to see a lot less coming through prices and more coming through investment.
Okay, let's take the second question. I know it's Toronto, and we'll go to a housing question before we finish. Absolutely, and you voted that one up. But just staying kind of in the area that we are a bit, but with gender divide issues. In rebalancing the labor market, what role should government play to ensure those already left behind women are not again disproportionately impacted? And we can certainly see differentials in labor market participation between men and women, and there's some policies being addressed that. But maybe you could take a shot at that. And indeed, are women, to what extent are women being disproportionately impacted?
So through the pandemic, there is no question women were disproportionately impacted by the pandemic, and that really reflected two things. One, women tend to work more in the service sector than in other sectors, and the close contact service sector was shut down. It was disproportionately affected. And then the other thing is schools were closed. parents of young children, it's pretty hard for them both to work. So typically one of the parents, and it was usually the mother, needed to either work less hours or in some case withdraw from the labor force altogether. And you can see this actually very clearly in the data. When schools closed, female participation and female hours worked really dropped. And one of the good things, though, is that in Canada, the female participation rate, when schools reopened, mothers came back to work. The female participation bounced back very quickly, and so now it is the big gap we saw between men and women during the pandemic has completely closed. Female participation is back to pre-pandemic levels. Now that doesn't mean we can't do better. We like to compare ourselves to the United States, and we actually look pretty good compared to the United States on female participation. It's quite a bit higher in Canada. I think we've got better maternity leave, better policies, and that's reflected in the data. But as I mentioned in my remarks, we're only just above the median of OECD countries in female participation. So there is room to improve that further. There is still, male participation is still higher than female, and if we can close that gap, that will provide an increased supply of labor and more potential for the Canadian economy to grow. Now, exactly the best way to do that is somewhat beyond monetary policy. The federal government has reached arrangements with provinces to put in place universal childcare. That certainly is one element that will help. And there are some other policies governments can look at.
This kind of makes me think about labor market participation. So unemployment is at almost historical lows, certainly in the last couple of generations. But labor force market participation has fallen by about 3 percentage points over the last 20 years, let's say. And what is driving that? This sort of starts before we're getting into the aging population that you were talking about before. What structural factors are we seeing there?
Well, the big one is the aging of the population. So the baby boomers are a big part, were a big part of the workforce. They're, the people born between, there's various measures, but the end of the war and 61 or 64, depending on how you measure it, there was very high birth rate, so they're a big piece of the labor force. So they're now, like I'm sort of right at the very end of the labor force. I'm still working, but most of the baby boomers are moving into retirement, and as they retire, so you've got all this big part of the workforce retiring, and the next generation that's replacing them is smaller. And it's a combination of, we've had declining fertility rates, so we've had smaller generations following them, and then you've got this big generation, they're retiring. So Canada has relied importantly on labor force growth to grow our economy. In fact, we've done very well on labor force growth. We haven't done as well on productivity. So looking forward, there's a few elements to sustaining growth. There's, the baby boomers are going to retire. We may be able to make it, work arrangements. People are living longer, they're healthier, they may want to work longer. There is capacity to make work more flexible to keep some of those people in the labor force. But, as they get older, clearly we know which way that's going to go. So, what are some of the other things we can do? Well, immigration, that can certainly augment. And, then the other part of it comes back to what I was talking to earlier, and that's increasing the output per worker, growing the productivity.
Okay, let's do the housing question as we get close to wrapping up here. And I'll try to give you a break on the last part of it. Canada house price to income ratio is the highest among our peers by a far margin. Investors are buying a growing share of new supply. I'd add that household debt is very high in Canada. I know you don't do microeconomics, so I won't ask you totally how do we address this unless you want to volunteer in that, but I do want to know how much that concerns you.
So We've been highlighting for some time that the combination of high house prices and high household indebtedness is a vulnerability to the Canadian economy. What do I mean by that? Well, what I mean by that is that if the economy were to slow sharply, that vulnerability could accelerate the downturn. If people lose their jobs, they're going to have a hard time covering their mortgage, and if they have a very big mortgage, their house price comes down. Even selling their house may not cover it. So that is a vulnerability, and a number of steps have been taken over recent years to try to manage that vulnerability. The question mentions investment. We have seen when house prices were going up rapidly, with a bit of a lag, we did see investor demand for housing. The number of housing purchases by investors did increase. Governments put in place restrictions on foreign investment on housing to try to dampen that down. The other thing, which I think was quite useful, is that there's a stress test. So when you go to get a mortgage, normally you have to qualify at 200 basis points, 2 percentage points above the current rate. When interest rates got very, very low, we knew that there was more capacity for them to go up because they were way below normal. So that was actually increased to a set rate of 5.25. So when people got a mortgage at very low interest rates, they did, the bank did have to establish that even if interest rates went up to 5.25, that they could cover that mortgage. So, that does mean, yes, we've raised interest rates rapidly. That is having an impact, particularly with people on variable rate mortgages.
Which is a fairly small number, I guess, on variable rate mortgages.
Most people have fixed rate mortgages, the 5-year being the most common. But it is true that in the last 2 years, through the pandemic, house prices went up 50%. The housing market was unsustainably hot, and more people than usual stretched to get into that market. And one of the ways they did that was they took a variable rate mortgage. As the question mentioned, a lot of them had quite high loan-to-value mortgages with variable rate mortgages. So it is not the biggest part of the market, but it has gotten bigger through the pandemic, and that is a vulnerability. That is a source of concern, and it does mean that this adjustment to higher interest rates is painful for that segment. Well, I think what you're seeing, is this on? Yeah, good. I think what you're seeing in the labor market is a labor market that's out of balance with a lot of unfilled jobs compared to the number of people that are looking for jobs. And what that means is that businesses simply have not been able to find enough workers to meet the demands that they're getting from their clients for the goods and services that they're selling. And so that labor market, it needs to rebalance. It's unsustainably tight. And this is a symptom more broadly of an economy that's in excess demand. And I think an important way that adjustment will take place is if we're raising interest rates rapidly, that's going to slow spending in the economy. That's going to reduce the demand for those goods and services. That'll ultimately contribute to less demand for labor. So those vacancies will come down. Now, I don't want to, and so that, and as I explained in the speech, given that we're in a period of very high vacancies, that adjustment could be more through vacancies. If we were in a period of very low vacancies, you'd think it would be more through unemployment. That doesn't mean that it'll be painless. If you got less vacancies, if you're looking for a job, it's probably going to take you longer to find a job. So that means the unemployment rate will go up. The other reality is, the way interest rates affect the economy, it's not entirely even. Some companies, some businesses, some sectors, the interest-sensitive sectors will be more affected. So in some of those sectors, they probably won't have enough work for all their workers. So hours will go down. In some case, their employment will go down. So the unemployment rate is likely to go up. But what we're saying is that we don't expect it to go up. We don't expect a large increase in unemployment in the way we've seen in past recessions. We're not expecting high unemployment by historical standards.
We'll go to Esteban. Oh, sorry, just wait for the mic. Thank you.
Esteban Duarte from Bloomberg News. Governor, what will you be looking for specifically in the next week inflation print that will guide you toward 25 or 50 basis points hike in your next meeting? And are larger than 25 basis points still on the table?
Well, so yes, we're going to get CPI next week. We certainly will be looking at that closely, but that's 1 month of CPI data, and we're going to be looking at labor market data. We're going to be looking at global supply chains. We're going to be looking at inflation expectations, and yes, we're going to be looking at inflation. I think there's a few things that we're particularly focused on as we look at inflation. As I highlighted a few weeks ago in Halifax, we're particularly focused on measures of underlying inflation or core inflation. And we've seen some reduction in headline inflation, but that has largely reflected declines in oil prices, which are related to declines in global oil prices. What we've seen so far, I would say, in terms of core inflation is that it has leveled off, it has stopped going up. I think what we'll be looking at going forward is, does it tick back up? Does it stay where it is, or does it start to come down? There are some tiny little green shoots, I would say, in the last couple CPI numbers. You can see the 3-month rates of core inflation have come down, but I'd highlight, they've come down to 4%. That's still too high. And we know those month-to-month numbers are very volatile, so we're really looking to see further declines and more sustained declines. So those are some of the things we'll be looking at in terms of the CPI. Look, in terms of the decision itself, I don't really have much to add from what I said at the press conference a couple of weeks ago. If you go back to July, we did 100, we did 75. The last meeting we did 50, and I think depending on, and we indicated that we expect interest rates do have further to go, and I think that could be another bigger than normal step, or it could be reverting to more normal 25 basis point steps. We'll see.
We'll go now to Mark.
Hi, Mark Randall with the Globe and Mail. Thanks for taking the question. I'm wondering, the jobs report we saw on Friday, quite a lot higher than expectations, and I'm wondering, did that surprise you, and how does that much larger October jobs number influence the rate path going forward, and does it make you reassess the choice to go 50 rather than 75 at your most recent hike?
Well, you get the labor force numbers every month, and it's not unusual to see some volatility in those. You'll remember, if you go back some of the previous months, I think the market at least was a bit surprised with some of the softer numbers. Last month you saw a bigger positive number. I think so. When you look at the labor force numbers, you want to look over the last several months, and I think what you've seen is that labor growth, employment growth was very strong, and it has leveled off. And if you look a level deeper, what you're starting to see is that we're starting to see some effects in the more interest-sensitive parts of the economy, construction, manufacturing. On the other hand, parts of the economy, particularly related to services, which are not terribly interest-sensitive. You don't buy services on credit, typically. As the economy is reopened, Canadians are, they want to enjoy a lot of those services they missed through the pandemic, and particularly in that sector, companies have been really trying to catch up with demand, and so you can see that in the employment numbers. I mean, what does this tell us? I mean, I think what I take away from the last several months is we continue to have an economy that's in excess demand. There are signs of the economy slowing, but the way I would put it is demand's up here, supply's here, the economy's slowing, but we're still in excess demand. That's still putting an upward pressure on inflation, and I think that is consistent with the view that we put out in our monetary policy report a few weeks ago, that we've needed these rapid increases in interest rates, and we expect we'll probably need to raise rates further to slow demand and bring inflation back to the target.
Moving now to the teleconference, I just want to remind people on the call to mute their line if they're not asking a question. You can do so by pressing *6 and unmute by pressing *6 again. We'll start with Paul Vieira.
Governor, you're expecting a rise in unemployment, the unemployment rate. Doesn't that suggest that an increased likelihood of a recession?
Well, a couple things there. We don't forecast the unemployment rate, but we do forecast GDP, and we really use the output gap as the most sort of comprehensive measure of domestic inflationary pressures. So our GDP forecast is that we expect growth is going to stall through the next 3 quarters, so basically zero growth. The fourth quarter, we're already in it, and the first half of next year, and then we expect growth will pick up after that. So what does that mean? It means that 2 or 3 quarters of slightly negative growth is just as likely as 2 or 3 quarters of positive growth. That's not a major recession, but it is certainly a significant slowing of the economy, and it does imply some increase in the unemployment rate. This is going to be a difficult adjustment, but we don't expect the kind of large increases in unemployment that we've seen in past recessions. We're not expecting high unemployment by historical standards.
We'll go now to Najud, followed by Dave from BNN. Go ahead, Najud.
Hi, Governor. I'm wondering, so it seems forecasters are expecting that next week's CPI data will show that inflation, the annual inflation rate went up in October because of rising gas prices. I'm wondering, I know the bank obviously can't control global factors, but what's the central bank's assessment of global risks right now? Are things evolving in the direction that bank feels better about, or are there concerns there?
Well, a couple of things in response. So first of all, our target is in terms of total CPI, and we are committed to bringing total CPI inflation back to our 2% target. As you highlighted, some of the components in total CPI, some of the more volatile components like oil prices, are largely determined in global markets, so they don't give you much of an indication of what your domestic inflationary pressures are. And as I responded to one of the earlier questions, we will be looking closely at our measures of core inflation as well as sort of a broader set of measures of underlying inflation to try to get a sense of our domestic inflationary pressures really starting to ease back, or are they still as strong as they've been. So we'll see what is in the CPI number. More broadly, in terms of global inflationary pressures, if you go over the past year, we were surprised by just how pervasive and how persistent these global supply chain issues were. There were a whole series of global supply shocks. If you look at some of the measures like shipping costs, delivery times globally, they have come down quite a bit. They're not back to normal, but they've certainly come off their peaks. So we do expect, and oil prices, they continue to be volatile and they're bouncing around. They're off the peaks. They have rebounded a bit, but they're certainly lower than the original the peaks going back a number of months. If you look at prices of a number of agricultural commodities, they have come off a bit. So one of the things we'll be looking at is, are Canadian businesses, seeing some of the easing in global supply chain issues? Is that making its way to Canadian businesses? And are we seeing any pass-through from lower commodity prices? I expect that pass-through, certainly on food, it'll come, but it's probably going to take some time. Food price inflation is very high, and that is certainly a concern.
Go ahead, Dave.
Hi, David, George Kosh here from BNN Bloomberg. Governor, you said you don't expect a large increase in unemployment, but there is presumably going to be an increase in unemployment in order to get the labor market here in Canada back to better balance. Are you able to better specify what you mean by an increase in unemployment? Are you talking about 1 or 2 percentage points? Currently, we're at 5.2%. Are you speaking about no greater than 3 percentage points? I'm just trying to better understand your definition of what a large increase actually is.
Well, as I said, we don't forecast the unemployment rate. As I indicated previously, what we do forecast is GDP growth. We expect GDP growth is going to be close to zero. That does imply, that does suggest there will be some increase in the unemployment rate. And what I would stress is that we actually need some slowing in the labor market. Vacancies are very elevated. Companies can't hire all the workers they need to meet the demand they're facing, and that is contributing. That's one part that is contributing to the inflationary pressures we're experiencing here in Canada. So we do need some slowing, but as I stressed, given that we've got a very high vacancy rate, we think more of that adjustment can come through vacancies. But it does imply some increase in unemployment. As I said, we don't think this is the kind of large increase in unemployment we've seen in past recessions. So just to put in, you want some numbers, typically if you look at recessions since the 1980s, unemployment's gone up, about 3 to 6 percentage points. So we're talking about something considerably less than that.
Next on my list, I have Steve from Reuters, and then we'll go to Craig Lord from Global. Go ahead, Steve.
Hi, Governor. So since April and after the fall economic statement, the federal government has added $22.9 billion in extra spending for the rest of this fiscal year and for the next fiscal year. And I just wanted you to tell me, if you can, what you think of this extra spending, and will it make your job harder?
I think the spending decisions are the government's spending decisions, and we're focused on our job. In terms of the spending, the government's spending decisions, obviously the fall economic statement came out after the monetary policy report, but actually a number of the spending decisions, like for example the temporary cut in the temporary increase in the GST credit, they had been announced before the fall economic statement. So a number of the spending commitments in the fall economic statement were already announced. So those are built into our forecast in the MPR. So when we get to do the next update of our forecast, we'll have not only the federal fall economic statement, we'll also have some provincial ones. We'll update those. But the budgetary forecasts, the spending decisions embedded in the fall economic statement would not be of, relative to what we've already got in, would not be of macroeconomic significance. Certainly, some of the measures will be very important for the individuals that they target, but they wouldn't be of macro significance. The other thing I would highlight is that when you look at spending, not all spending has the same types of effect on inflation, and particularly, measures that are more targeted to expanding the supply capacity of the economy. So targeted to accelerate investment, for example, or announcements to increase the number of immigrants. Those expand supply. They will expand demand as well, but they're contributing to supply. So those have less inflationary impacts than things that are purely adding to demand. So you've got to look at not only what the spending is, but what the spending's on.
Craig Lord.
Hi there. Thanks for taking our questions, Governor Macklem. You spoke a little bit at the end of the Q&A about the vulnerability of highly indebted Canadians, and you mentioned that the stress test is something that's mitigating risks in the housing market. But do you think that Canadians who took out variable rate mortgages during the pandemic really understood the risk of rising rates when they took them out?
Well, I hope they got good advice from their financial institution. Look, I do think for some Canadians, as I mentioned, who took, we had an unsustainably hot housing market. Housing prices went up 50% in the first 2 years of the pandemic. They've now come down about 2%. We've seen a fairly marked slowing in activity in housing, and that really reflects a couple things. Part of that big run up in housing reflected pandemic-induced demand for housing. We were all spending most of our lives at home. People wanted more space. Now the economy's opened up. People are getting back to doing more and more things. And then the other thing, of course, is interest rates were very low. As we raised rates rapidly, that is certainly cooling the housing market. That is part of the adjustment to getting this economy into better balance. But I am acutely aware that some Canadians took out fairly high ratio mortgages late in that cycle with variable rates, and with the rapid increase in rates, their borrowing costs are resetting, and it is a difficult adjustment for them. The stress test certainly provided some buffer, and I hope that that is helping them.
All right, thank you. Unfortunately, that is all the time we have today. Thanks to everyone for taking the time to join us. Merci and bon après-midi.